Hi, I'm Seamless, and today I'm going to talk to you about hardware. This video's title is Hardware, Do You Need It? Or something like that. I haven't actually figured it out yet, but the short answer is not really. But you're not here for the short answer. So, my thoughts on hardware and whether or not, it's necessary for any purpose is actually pretty similar to my thoughts on how to choose the particular plugins you want to use, which I'm sure you probably see in the related videos. That's a topic I've already discussed. But that thought is basically about its perceived utility, about what it can do, what I need it to do, and can it do what I want to do, and can it do things that software can't do, and can it do things better than software can do. And then beyond that, doesn't matter. Like, whether or not it matters can mean a number of things to every individual, but for me, mostly, it's about, especially when we're talking about like super technical, like nitty-gritty detail stuff, it becomes about whether or not a person can perceive the difference in using it. And then, if they can perceive the difference, if that difference can actually be attributed to the actual piece of hardware. And by that, about the attribution business, I mean, for example, there's a lot in the metal producer world about like cab matching and tone matching for your guitars, and there's particular pieces of hardware that do it digitally, and then there's software that can do it pretty similar. I'm not talking about the software hardware part. I'm talking about the part where these pieces of hardware are digitally recreating what actual like a guitar like tube stack amplifiers can do, and make a tone that's not just similar but just about identical. And the question of can you perceive a difference, the answer is yes, you can perceive a difference. But if you were not told which one was which, you would not be able to place which one was the physical one and which one was the digital one. You could tell that they're different, but unless you had a beyond intimate understanding of both, or I guess just one of them, you wouldn't really be able to recognize one or the other. And if you're not able to do that, then nobody listening to the music, who are they themselves, not producer, are never going to be able to tell any of this stuff. And that's what it means matters to me, for that matter, because like if it's not the same but it's also not bad, then I'm gonna go with whatever's easier to do, which for the most part is using software. But I mean, that's not the ultimate answer, because there's also stuff like workflow, whether or not you notice it and then you actually care, because not everybody makes music for listeners. Some people make it for themselves, and to that end, if you can tell a difference and you don't like the difference, then obviously go with whatever it is that you want or need to be what you want. And then, of course, the practical uses of it, and then whether or not it has abilities and things it can do that are not replicable in the digital world, which day by day is becoming less and less of a thing, because the digital technology and the processing abilities of computers are pretty freaking good now. It didn't used to always be. It wasn't always the case, and hardware definitely had an advantage for a very long time, especially because analog synthesizers, especially, were basically the first kind of synthesis. I hate that word, God. But it's not just about synths, though. It's also about things like hardware compressors, equalizers, boards, boards, that kind of stuff. And like what use do they have? What is their value? And do you need it? Like a lot of times, actually, I haven't been posed this question that much as of late. I wonder why. Because it did used to be kind of a thing. A lot of people would discuss about, do I need hardware? Do the people who do the most amazing kinds of sound design, do they use only hardware? Or the sounds that they're making product of the fact that they use hardware, can this be done digitally, or is it still just better with hardware? And like those questions are kind of interesting to answer. Not necessarily difficult, because case by case you could make a very direct comparison one way or the other. And in fact, like if people are still asking these questions, it's probably no, in terms of is it necessary? Because if it was necessary, it's the same thing as about people being asked, like, what are the best of this and that? What's the best of this and that? If the bestness of something was so objective that you could actually give a quantifiable answer to that answer, the answer to that question would have been answered so long ago, and that would have been a staple of what everyone's already doing, and it would have been an extremely known quantity. Like that's what would happen if there was an answer to that question. But as far as like the advantages of hardware, it's like basically is that like for a lot of stuff they are able to do things at a tactical level that digital versions of them cannot. And mostly in the realm, especially for purely analog hardware, it's mostly in the realm of processing speed, because analog hardware do not have latency. Purely analog hardware. So there's that. There's also a whole bunch of funky like optical compressors are a thing, and to take the particular way by which they measure their kind of compression and how they activate are particularly impressive. And I'm pretty sure only something that can happen in real life, as opposed to synthetic life. However, recently I was actually able to use hardware for not the first time, but for the first time where I actually knew what I was doing. I've used synths before, but it was mostly like, I don't know what these knobs do. I don't know when anything happens. But when I went to visit Cell Dweller a while ago, I think in January, I was able. That really wasn't that long ago, but I felt like forever ago. Man, time moves really slowly when you're busy. But anyway, I was able to use the hardware, and I was able to do stuff on purpose that I understood that would have particular results based on what I understood from synthesis, and it actually worked out pretty good. And while I was using methods that only exist in the hardware world, which is to say the whole FM everything thing, where you can FM any kind of parameter, any kind of sound, and you just chains, and then there's a bunch of stuff that they can do. That whole process is definitely a thing that's not very well represented in the synthesis world. And you might be thinking, well, but there's FM synths. And yeah, you can do a kind of FM with tones and whatever, but things like FMing parameters, like filters, there's a filter FM kind of effect in Massive, but that's a very limited experience. And you might have seen the Circle 2 plugin that I did a first look on, and it has a little bit of FM everything inside it, but it's also very limited and not super as expressive as what can be done with actual hardware. So that's something that is still something that's limited to the hardware world. The thing is, though, so the kind of sounds that I was making with that, which were cool, they're not impossible to make digitally through just other means. There's other ways to do that, and that's where it became kind of a weird experience for me. And this is one of those moments where you have to factor in other reasons why you might want hardware. For example, while the sounds that I was making were very much stuff I could have made digitally, it would have been very hard to make them as they were digitally. And it was very easy to make them as they were with the hardware. It was not difficult. It was a lot of fun, actually. The workflow is extremely conducive to creating that style of sound that I was just doing. And it's just what they did. And it wasn't about the fact that I didn't know what it was doing. I knew everything about what it was doing. It's just that because it was doing what it was doing, it was able to get to a place a lot easier and a lot faster than I could have with related digital processes. So there's that kind of benefit. For other stuff, here's something that I find interesting about the modern producer world, and it's even in the recording world, because I do a lot of recording too. I have that video I just put up with the guy, the drumming. I have a mixer on my desk, but that's not what I use it for. I use that for streaming and recording stuff like this, for wacky routing to be able to have FL audio, system audio, my audio, all this stuff up. That's what I have that for. I'm using it literally as a mixer to mix stuff together. But for recording, all the ins, I have a snake, I have 16 inputs, and they're all going right into my interfaces. I am not using a board at all. I'm not using any kind of recording thing. And when I look at really expensive looking huge, you see them all the time. You can just Google recording studio and go look at these ridiculously impressive looking studios with billion channel boards. I don't see the value in that anymore. And there is value in that if you want, for example, a perfectly and completely analog signal chain for recording, where you're recording to tape or something, and then you're pressing the vinyl. You need to have that kind of hardware if you're going to do that. But if you're going to do the digital related stuff, then you do not need that. You might want it for a bunch of different reasons, the workflow being one of them. People who are used to working with that kind of gear will obviously want to use that kind of gear. It's still I personally, I've used mixing consoles. I've used large mixers for stuff like front of house mixing and live mixing and that kind of thing. And that's always been whatever. However, I see people doing shows now with iPads, with an audio interface and an iPad doing the job of what a mixer could do. And that's just what life is now, because as I said, the digital technology has caught up pretty quickly. It's pretty similar to how the way video processing works, because for a long time, film and film-based things for photography as well were kind of a limit that digital versions of the technology could not approach. And like for like the 90s, digital photography was a megapixel at best, and the really expensive ones could do maybe 8 or 9. And there was my dad who worked in photo finishing would tell me about how like regular, like just your disposable camera film has a resolution of about 20 megapixels, and now we have cameras that have like 4 times that, and they're not even that expensive. And now we have things like 6K and 8K video recorders, and we have things that are like, honest to God, way better working with it than film, because film as a medium, while it might have like it might look. And this is something else about it, though. It's like it's not really better or worse at this point. It's just different. Film has a very distinctive look to it, and so does digital stuff. And people who grew up on film might prefer film, just like people who grew up with tapes might prefer tapes or vinyl. That whole thing. The newer generation sees the two as just being two different things, and they don't really see a benefit of committing to a medium whose stockpile is like deteriorating, and that's something similar for recording. Is that like when I'm thinking about, because I'm actually building a new studio in a town over with some guys, and when I'm designing the studio, I'm not taking into account getting a gigantic desk, a gigantic mixing console desk. I'm just not doing that, and that didn't even enter into my mind because it's not something I need. And it's something about, and this has to do with the idea of the synths, the hardware synths, the idea that like I could do a sound with a hardware synth that I could do digitally. And the idea of the tone matching, where you could do it either with the digital hardware or you could do it with the actual analog tube stuff. Both of these will create results. Just buy the results. You can give them to someone else and ask them which one of these was made digitally, which one of these was made with analog. Given that you're playing them both back on a digital medium, by the way. And they'll most of the time won't be able to tell. They won't be able to answer you. They might be able to do it if you give them some like analysis tools and like actually be able to measure some stuff. And like because sometimes analog recordings look kind of weird, but the results speak for themselves and they're comparable. It's the same thing with recording a band. If I'm just doing direct digital and mixing everything in FL Studio, I can make stuff sound like things that in the 90s cost somebody $100,000 to record on some gigantic mixing desk in a $2 million room with outboard gear out the wazoo. Here's something else about that. I know people. I've talked to older producers who worked in that environment in that time, and they all prefer the digital world. They all prefer the convenience, the ease of use. They don't even talk about any kind of noticeable quality difference. They don't miss having to deal with hardware. And I mean, but if I had all the money in the world, I would get all of that just to see what it was like. But as far as like super serious results driven producing whatever, I'm not going to be like, I need to get hardware. I need to have this. It's limiting me in my sound choices. It's limiting me in my abilities, limiting me in the kind of results I can create. It is at no point, especially now, is the digital versus analog going to limit you in the kind of results that you make. It might limit you in the kind of workflow that you yourself are the best at using. But in terms of raw technical ability to make stuff that you want to make, just about, like, this is why I've always been a proponent about learning the basics of every kind of synthesis, because if you do, you'll quickly discover that if you know enough about what you're doing, you can do anything with anything. And this is still true for hardware versus digital stuff. It's just that it's more clear now because the digital stuff is actually pretty good versus when it was really all that good as early as maybe 7 years ago. You know what I mean? So people have this, still have this stigma in their head about, vintage being better and like need a hardware, need to spend all the money in the world to be in a recording studio and that kind of stuff. And like just based purely on the results, it's really not necessary. It's really not. In fact, I'm pretty sure a lot of the higher up, larger, god level producers are actually moving away from doing that anyway. And Skrillex famously just produces what he does on laptops. He was in that video with the Doors, and he brought a MacBook into a $1 million studio. Well, I don't know how much that studio cost, and sat it on a desk. I don't even know if he even used a desk, but that's in that video, and it's funny. But yeah, like the end result of all this is that there are some pieces of hardware that do some cool stuff, and that can do things like literally do some stuff that you cannot do digitally. But you got to also think about what that results in. Granted, I haven't had enough time to mess around with the the full capabilities of what a piece of hardware could do with synthesis, and I am still planning on getting my own analog modular rig. And when I do, I may full well discover some things, some kind of sounds that are just absolutely not reproducible by anything in the digital realm. However, there's also just like, there are far more things on the digital realm that you cannot do analog than there are things in the analog realm that you cannot do digitally. Like, the whole concept of additive synthesis is not something that you can really take advantage of analog and with analog hardware. There are some kinds of ways that you can mess with it, but not to the degree that you could do stuff with, say, Harmor. And Harmor can make a whole crap ton of sounds that are just straight up not possible with analog hardware. So, I mean, based on all kinds of practicality, expense, workflow, results, and all that kind of stuff, the digital stuff will win every single time. And there's something, I mean, it's just a human nature to be like, I want the best of the best, and go for, like, you know, the revered Fairchild, not Fairchild, that compressor, the hell was that called? Well, there's the Farlight synthesizer that BT got recently, and that was mostly for him, just like a cool look into how things used to be done, because he himself started producing on like completely inferior systems. Like his original album made on a piece of hardware that he showed me that miraculously still works, that I don't even know how to look at and do stuff with. This is an analog, it's like a original briefcase computer. It's ridiculous. And he's always moved on with the times and done stuff, you know, analog and digital, that pushed the realm just with the bleeding edge, that kind of stuff. And then he went and got a Farlight because he could, because he's BT. But the Fairchild, that's a compressor. It's like a super revered, like super, because it was on all these famous albums and whatever. And the thing about like vintage stuff is that we tend to revere it because it was on stuff that like shaped the way that we understand music to sound, like the older school metal and rock recordings, like Black Sabbath, or even older than that, the Beatles, that kind of thing. But by no means was that stuff even close to technically superior to anything that we have now. And not only that, but a lot of people have this weird assumption that whatever was done with that kind of hardware back in the day was like their original idea and not just a product of the ludicrous limitations that they had to live with. And that if they transported in time, had access to everything that we have now, that they wouldn't have done something completely different. And that doesn't necessarily matter, because obviously you're going to be into whatever you're into sound-wise. And if you're just kind of like, I really want to make something that sounds exactly like something from the 70s, then why not go get hardware that's from the 70s? In fact, one of the funniest movies I've seen in recent memory is a movie called Black Dynamite. And that was its whole premise, is that it was basically making a parody of 70s blaxploitation movies, I guess early 80s or whatever the hell it was made. And they went and got gear from that era, and they made the movie on gear from that era. And so it looks exactly like a movie from that era. And if that's the kind of crap that they're doing, if you're essentially making a period piece out of your music, then that's the way to go. But if you're just going for the best that you could possibly do with the vision you have in your brain about what just is music and just doing and going, you can do that with the synthetic digital tools that you have available to you. You can. You really can. That was a whole lot of not necessarily conflicting information, but that was a lot of me apologizing for people that might have differing views. I mean, for me personally, it's always been, like I said, about results, and the results have always spoken for themselves, and so that's all that I've ever cared about. And I know that's not what everyone cares about, but a lot of people have it in their heads that hardware is some kind of magical wind pill that they can just take and do amazing things with it really easily. And you can do some pretty cool shit with it really easily, but it's not so much easier than doing it with the synthetic stuff that you are prevented from doing that with the digital stuff. The non-synthetic stuff, it's all synthetic, digital. You're not limited by the digital stuff in a way that you think that you're somehow prevented from like actualizing your full potential because you don't have access to hardware. The stuff is not. And not only that, but if you have not, I bring this up whenever I talk about digital versus hardware, analog versus software. If there's a video, just on YouTube, Google, they just search xiph.org digital sampling. And there's a video of a guy discussing what digital sampling does. And we're talking about sample rates and bit depth and what those two things really mean, and what that practically means when it comes to things like the whole idea of sampling something is losing quality out of a sound. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Like, the way that digital sampling works is actually kind of very impressive, and there is not a noticeable quality difference between like an analog recording versus a digital recording. There's really not. There's not, and if there is, like I said, if there's a difference, a noticeable difference, it's not something that's quantifiably worse or better. It's just difference. And like, although there is a lot about digital that is quantifiably way better than its analog counterparts when it comes to just a whole host of things. But like, when people talk about this stuff, especially if they are themselves producers, they talk about stuff like they need hardware, they need some vintage gear, they need more expensive plugins, or that certain things can't do certain things. Like, I mean, certain things definitely cannot do certain things, but like, it's just that their like defeatist opinion just sort of seeps in there, and they're just looking for scapegoats to like, so that they can think to themselves that like, I don't actually need to learn more. I just don't have the gear that's enabling me to do what I want to do. And you really can just learn more and then be able to do it yourself. I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this yourself. I've personally experienced it myself in the past, where I thought that I was sucking, not because of my own sucking, but because I lacked particular gear or synth plugins, whatever. That got disproven fast. But the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of people think that, you know, hardware is this magic pill. It's really not. It's just not. It's cool. It's neat. It's kind of a gigantic pain in the butt to operate, but it's not so amazing that it'll just cure all your ails, and that you'll really do anything different with it that you would have done with digital stuff. But the workflow might be different. So there's that. That's a valid thing, which is the only reason why Reason as a piece of software is any kind of popular. Anyway, I hope that made sense. If you have any questions about this, oh, wait a minute, I have to say the thing. Please like, favorite, and subscribe. And then if you have any questions about this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.